Welcome to Module 4, Evacuation and Transportation of the Horse Council of British Columbia Emergency Preparedness Training Series. During a natural disaster, such as a flood or fire, we have learned that there is a very high likelihood that animals are going to require evacuation. Though necessary, this can be very dangerous for the owners, volunteers, and the animals. In order to mitigate risk for volunteers, we must first identify what the most common risks are. For evacuation and transportation, this would include a motor vehicle incident, such as a collision or rollover, the driver or passenger injured in a motor vehicle incident, the animal injured in a motor vehicle incident, a vehicle is stranded after becoming stuck or broke down, an evacuation trailer becomes trapped in the flood or fire zone, animals become agitated, elevating the risk to the handlers, a handler is injured during active handling, or theft of the animals. Risk can be reduced by ensuring that only skilled drivers are utilized who drive cautiously and are familiar with the designated routes. Make sure all vehicles are in good working condition and travel only on safe roads. Only people trained and skilled in handling horses are enlisted. Utilize safe horse handling practices, as will be discussed in Module 9. Ensure all animals are identified upon arrival and evacuation sites are secure, and that all transport vehicles are inspected to be safe and free of projectiles and areas where animals can injure themselves. We are going to do a brief review of the evacuation site considerations that we discussed in Module 3. First and foremost is accessibility. Are stock or commercial trailers able to easily access the site? And will the site remain accessible during an emergency event? What is the most direct and safest way in or out of the site? Where is the highest concentration of your equine population? Is there an area in the region that has the highest concentration of equine? And how accessible is the evacuation site to this location? What are your alternate routes? If one route becomes inaccessible, you will need to identify alternative routes. And if you need to evacuate the evacuation site, are you able to? When you are building your trailer evacuation network, things you should consider include the location of the trailers. Are they accessible to all areas of your municipality? Is there accessibility at risk during the emergency event, such as are they on the floodplain or in the fire hazard area? Do you have access to trailers outside of the region for backup if local trailers are unavailable or inaccessible? Larger trailers are best so they can accommodate numerous animals versus only one or two. It is also best to utilize ground load trailers. Even though larger commercial single-deck trailers can haul a high number of animals, they will require loading and unloading ramps. Does the trailer have gates that allow for segregation of animals when necessary? And finally, are the owners properly insured and bonded? Each of these should be considered when identifying resource trailers. Proper preparation for evacuation and transport of animals is vital to success. The following list is tasks that you should do before an emergency event occurs as part of your preparedness planning. Once you identify where your evacuation sites will be located, you will want to identify the most probable routes to each designated evacuation site, identify the transporters and trailers for each area and gather their contact information. Along with their contact information, you will want to document the number of horses each trailer can transport. You will need to also provide each transporter with the locations of the evacuation sites and the evacuation routes. They will also need all the necessary paperwork for evacuation, such as evacuation forms and trailer inspection sheets, which we are going to address later in this module. You will need to identify ahead of time what method of communication you will use to communicate to horse owners where the evacuation sites are located and the routes they should use. As an example, you may choose to use Facebook or Twitter. You will want to share ahead of time how the evacuation information will be shared, where evacuation sites will be located, and what the most likely routes will be. Doing each of these ahead of an event will make the actual evacuation safer and more efficient. Once the trailers and transporters are identified, the owners should be encouraged to perform an inspection of the trailer and their towing vehicle to ensure that they are roadworthy and ready to go. They will need to verify that there are no sharp or protruding objects that may injure the animals or the handlers, that all gates swing freely and close securely. The trailer must have non-slip flooring. All lights should be working, including the tail lights, brake lights, turn signals, and interior lights. Brakes should be inspected that they are functioning properly. The trailer must allow for proper ventilation. All ramps must be secure and open and close freely. And the hitch, safety chains, light cables, stabilizer bars are all available and in good working condition. If they find any deficiencies, they should be repaired before they transport animals. You will also want to ensure that the towing vehicle itself is road ready. Here is an example of a checklist to ensure you inspect and repair all necessary areas. This checklist should be provided to all transporters ahead of an emergency event. And finally, all transporters must be aware of the requirements under the Health of Animals Act Part 12, which is the regulatory requirements for the transport of animals in Canada. They include the prohibition of overcrowding animals during transport, the prohibition of transportation of animals that are unfit to travel, that carriers cannot load, transport, or unload animals in a way that would cause injury or undue suffering to them, that animals must be protected from adverse weather and adequate ventilation must be provided during transport, the use of only proper containers and transport vehicles, and the segregation of incompatible animals. More information on these regulations can be found by doing a Google search of the Health of Animals Regulations, Part 12. This section is going to cover how to implement your evacuation and transportation response plan for both organizers and volunteers. Once it has been determined that evacuations are going to be required, the organizers must begin the implementation of the plans. First, you must notify your predetermined facility volunteers that evacuations are beginning and that they need to report to the site. You will then want to contact your evacuation transport volunteers, directing them to either specific locations to assist with the evacuation or have them report to the evacuation site for further direction. You will need to post all necessary signage directing evacuees to the evacuation routes and the evacuation sites. You will need to implement your communication plan, notifying horse owners of the location of the evacuation sites, what routes they need to take, and how to contact you if they need help evacuating. You may need to set up traffic management, if necessary, for evacuation routes and at the evacuation site itself. Make sure that all your volunteers are aware of the active disaster areas and what to do in case of an emergency themselves. Begin to prepare the site to receive animals as outlined in Module 2. And you will want to assign someone on your team to continually monitor the status of the emergency event itself, all of the evacuation sites and routes, and keep everyone up to date on any changes. If you are a member of the evacuation transport team, once you receive notice that evacuations are going to begin, you must hook up your trailer, and a quick readiness to transport checklist must be completed to ensure you are safe and ready to respond. Often, in hurried, high excitement situations, things get overlooked. You will need to bed the trailer as needed and make sure the hitch is correctly attached and secured. The brake and light cables must be correctly plugged in and safety chains attached. Check all tires to make sure they are properly inflated, and test your lights to ensure that your tail lights, brake lights, and turn signals are all working. You will want to check that all gates, inside and out, are closed and secured shut. Windows with screens should be open and vents set to allow for necessary ventilation. Make sure you have extra halters and lead shanks packed in the trailer. And check that you have the necessary paperwork, such as evacuation forms, along with a list of emergency contact numbers and the evacuation route maps. First aid kits for both humans and animals should be available, and the truck filled with gas. Once your trailer is ready to roll, head out to the locations designated by the evacuation committee. This may be directly to a horse facility or to the evacuation site for dispatch out to facilities. It is a best practice to work with a partner. Do not go alone. Use good driving practices at all times, whether you have horses in the trailer or not. Do not put yourself in harm's way. This includes only travel on safe roads. Do not take shortcuts. As an example, do not go down a logging road. Respect road closures set up by first responders. You do not want to become a victim. And do not drive into fire or flood areas you may not be able to get out of. Don't set yourself up to be a rescue case. Proceed to the location identified by the evacuation committee. Upon arrival, identify the location of the animals and the best place to load them. Owners may or may not be present to help you. And always be on the lookout for any hazards at the site, including aggressive dogs or other animals. Once horses that require evacuation have been located and identified, you will want to catch and load them using safe handling practices that we will discuss in Module 9. If you cannot locate any halters or not enough halters, you will need to use one of the extras you brought with you. Do not put yourself in harm's way with the animals. If a horse refuses to load, it may have to be left behind. Also, as we discussed in Module 3, and will discuss further in Module 9, not all horses are halter broke, trained to lead, or trained to load in a trailer. You will need to fill out the equine evacuation form. This includes the location you picked the horse up at, any owner information you have, the number of horses you evacuated, and any means of identifying a horse, such as a brand, markings, or a tag. This is discussed in more depth in Module 6. You will also need to do a quick assessment of the health and fitness of the animals and document any injuries or apparent illnesses. Once you are loaded and ready to go, you must stay in contact with the evacuation committee. This includes informing them when you depart the facility to provide an estimated time of arrival at the evacuation site. You will also want to let them know the number of animals you are transporting and if there are any animals that require medical attention. You will want to drive cautiously and on alert for any road hazards, including animals fleeing the area on their own. Upon arrival at the evacuation site, proceed to the check-in and unloading area. You will want to turn in your paperwork and get directions on where to unload the animals. Once the animals are checked in and unloaded, you will need to replenish any necessary supplies such as halters, bedding, or paperwork. And finally, do a quick clean of the trailer in the designated cleanout area before the next trip when possible. Now for a quick review of the key points from this module. Identify evacuation sites and routes before the event occurs. Volunteers should perform a pre-event assessment of their trailers and do all necessary repairs ahead of time. Work with a partner at all times. Do not go it alone. Never put yourself in harm's way by entering high-risk areas where you can become trapped by the fire or flood. Practice safe equine handling practices at all times. The animals are scared and experiencing unfamiliar events and people. And fill out the equine evacuation form for all animals you transport. We have reached the end of Module 4. You can now proceed to Module 5, Biosecurity.